Hello. If you joined us last time, you heard me talking about the culture wars that will emerge in the 1990s. And I told you at the time that what this is going to do is it's going to set the stage for the election of 2000. And that's certainly what we're going to talk about early on here in this video lecture right now. The election of 2000 would pit the Republican candidate, George W. Bush, against the former Vice President, Al Gore. And before we go ahead and talk about all of this, I want to go through the backgrounds of each individual candidate. The name Bush should sound familiar to you. Bush was the son of former President George Herbert Walker Bush. Before he was president, he was a very powerful senator slash governmental official. So Bush was very plugged in. Okay. As a young man, he was a bit of a hellraiser. He dabbled a bit into alcoholism. We can talk about that here in just a minute. But for right now, he went to the most elite schools, right? He went to Yale as an undergrad. Later on, he went to Harvard for a master's in business. He grew up in not only a really well-respected political family, but a very, very well-to-do American family when it comes to, material well-being. They were very wealthy. Okay. George Bush is going to go through this transformation as a young adult, and ultimately he's going to discover evangelical Christianity. And much of this has to do with his attempt to address his alcohol addiction or his alcoholism. And the good news is that very much is helpful in that respect of his life. Okay. He's also going to become deeply immersed in the politics of what we've described as the religious right. The problem that Bush is going to have early on in launching a political career is he hadn't really done anything. He doesn't have a lot of experience. He's got a great last name. And certainly, he's got the means to be a titan in American politics, but there's not really very much that he could point to when it comes to this whole issue of experience. And that would change with the strategist known as Karl Rove. Karl Rove was a brilliant political strategist, and he knew a winner when he saw one. He saw the word winner written all over George W. Bush. And he knew that this whole issue of experience was going to be a problem. And that's why he advised George W. Bush to be on message time after time after time after time. Bush, you are the guy that Americans can sit down and have a beer with, right? You're the guy that can talk Texas Rangers football or UT Longhorn football. I said Rangers football. I meant baseball. You understood what I meant. In any case, you're the guy that's the everyman guy, right? The only issue is, you're clearly not in that capacity. Okay. The message that George Bush is going to come up with is compassionate conservatism. Okay. This is going to mean something along the lines of, listen, if you like conservatism, I'm your man. I'm a conservative, just like my father, just like Ronald Reagan was a conservative, but I'm not without compassion. I understand that for millions and millions of Americans, these federal programs that have evolved throughout the years, they're the difference between making it and not making it. So I'm not just going to come into the federal government with a butcher's knife and start hacking things away, right? Anyway, compassionate conservatism is going to do George Bush a lot of favors, and in that capacity, Karl Rove probably deserves a lot of that credit. His opponent, Al Gore, is also a man of privilege, right? His father was a senator from Tennessee. He had gone to Harvard. He had gone to elite schools for his entire life. He was plugged in socially, politically, as well as financially as well. And ultimately, what Al Gore is going to do is he's going to make the very conscious decision to not campaign alongside Bill Clinton. That was a very important decision, primarily because Bill Clinton was a pretty popular president by 2000. The economy was pretty good by the end of 2000. Many people had jobs, were spending money, the economy was growing, and a lot of people, whether you think this is fair or not, gave Bill Clinton the credit for that economy, all right? And so Al Gore is not going to do this. He's not going to campaign next to Bill Clinton the way that that Richard Nixon did with Dwight Eisenhower. Okay. In any case, George Bush is going to run on lower taxes, a strong military, and to reach out to his religious right friends, restoring the honor of the office of the presidency. In other words, I agree with you that Bill Clinton's cheating and scandals and just utter cultural rot is a problem. You elect me, and I will bring back honor to the office of the presidency. Al Gore ran on this really kind of wishy-washy platform, never really came to terms with his liberalism. It's probably pretty fair to say that he was more liberal than Bill Clinton, especially on economic matters. But he doesn't wear that on his sleeve because, as you might remember, liberals had become more or less a dirty word in the 1980s. And the Bush campaign would really kind of bring back that whole mantra. You'll see what I mean probably in the next lecture. But the election of 2000 is going to go down as not only one of the closest in American history, but also one of the most controversial. I remember vividly what was going on that night. All the red states, like North Carolina, Kentucky, Indiana, they turned red very early in the night. And all the traditional blue states, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, they all turned blue pretty early. And I remember a state that everybody was going to be very, very purple, saying was going to be very purple, turning blue very early in the night. And of course, I'm talking about Florida. I remember when they called the state of Florida for Al Gore. They reported that it was Al Gore that was the projected winner there. And I thought to myself at the time, that's really bad news if you're George Bush. Number one, those were 19 electoral votes that you couldn't afford to give up. And number two, the guy that's running Florida at the time, the governor of Florida, is none other than his own brother, Jeb Bush. If you can't take a very critical state like Florida, a state that your own brother is the governor, I don't see any real path to the White House. So I went to bed that night assuming that Al Gore was going to be the next president. Woke up, Florida wasn't red, it wasn't blue, it was yellow. There's a lot of controversy surrounding Florida. It was too close to call. They called it at first for Al Gore, and then it went back and it said, no, we got it wrong. It's actually George Bush that was the projected winner. It turned red, and by the end of the night, Florida was too close to call. It was yellow. We don't know who the next president is the day after the election. What we do know is that Al Gore had won the popular vote. And we know, um, in the context of history, including recent history, that you can lose the popular vote. You can lose it quite badly, actually, and you can still win in the Electoral College. Now, the other thing that we have to determine is exactly what's going on in Florida, right? We need a recount. We need to make sure that we got this one right. And so the recount begins, and at its height, there are 500 votes that are separating George Bush from Al Gore, meaning George Bush is ahead, but he's ahead by the narrowest, the most razor of thinnest margins. And in that particular moment, the Supreme Court weighs in a one and only sort of decision entitled Bush versus Gore. What Bush versus Gore says is that recount violated Floridians' 14th Amendment rights, their rights as citizens under the U.S. Constitution. What that meant as far as the recount was concerned was that it was over. Whoever is ahead right now as we speak, that would be determined to be the winner. The person that was ahead right now was George W. Bush, who was determined to be the winner. What Bush versus Gore does, guys, is it basically makes George W. Bush the next president of the United States. As you can imagine, that was very, very controversial. Number one, he lost the popular vote. That doesn't exactly scream mandate, okay? Number two, many people that were critical of Bush said it really wasn't even the Electoral College that elected you. It was the Supreme Court. It was 9 men and women in robes that were appointed by presidents, people like your father, George W. Bush, that had appointed them, that felt loyalty toward them, that basically decided that they were going to vote to end the recount that led the way to your presidency. And so my point is, to many, many Americans, it was the Supreme Court that elected George Bush, not the American people. Again, we've seen this. If you think back to 1960 in this class, John Kennedy was elected, but he was elected by a very, very narrow margin. And the last thing that Kennedy wanted to do was engage the civil rights movement, choose sides. And the reason was very simple, right? To do that was a very controversial thing. And to choose sides could be to isolate key important realms of the American Democratic Party, especially the American South. And so, as a tactical maneuver, Kennedy tried as he might not to engage the civil rights movement. He didn't want to make really big controversial decisions. George Bush is not really going to be hampered by that mentality. He's not really going to govern very reluctantly. And one of the reasons that we think that that was the case was the guy that you're looking at the bottom of that PowerPoint screen right there, the vice president under George Bush, and that would be Dick Cheney. Cheney, like many members of the Bush administration, was a holdover from the Reagan-Bush, H.W. Bush years. He had been the Secretary of Defense during Operation Desert Storm. He had served in many capacities in the Reagan administration. He wasn't a compassionate conservative like George Bush campaigned on. He was a neoconservative, right? People like Cheney felt that the United States had won the Cold War, and to the victor go the spoils, and so we should have the lead. And in a way, we should be paid deference in terms of what this post-Cold War world looks like. When it comes to issues involving domestic agenda, go back to the Reagan years of cutting taxes. Go back to the Reagan years of getting government out of the way of business, right? Now, all that's fine and well, except that the Democrats still own at least one branch of the government, and that would be Congress. And that's going to change too when a Texas congressman by the name of Tom DeLay is going to embark on what he calls his K Street project. Now, in Washington, what's along K Street are lobbyist firms. What lobbyists do is they provide reelection money to people that they want to try to influence in terms of policies, what laws get passed, what policies get implemented. That's ultimately what lobbyists are doing. And Tom DeLay is going to be very successful in this K Street project. And what I mean by that is a lot of these Washington, great big huge lobbyist firms are going to line up behind DeLay and the Republicans. And with this K Street money, DeLay is going to declare all-out war on the Democrats. Now, the way that this typically goes is whoever wins the presidency, that following midterm election cycle, loses, and usually loses pretty badly in those elections. What I mean here, if you're old enough to remember the election of 2010, Barack Obama had won in 2008, but the Democrats lost badly in the House elections in 2010. You saw a Republican takeover, and part of the reason why Obama had so much trouble getting things passed is because the Republicans were just determined not to go along with a lot of his agenda. Bush is not going to have that problem. The Republicans are going to do very well in 2002, and we think a lot of the reason why is that Tom DeLay's money really talked, and a lot of these Republican politicians are going to come to Congress, and ultimately what it's going to mean is that the Republicans are going to control all three levers of government when it comes to the White House, the Senate, as well as the House of Representatives, right? Bush has a mandate in that capacity. This is a real opportunity to get some things done. And what George Bush's top priority was cutting taxes. To be entirely fair to Bush, he does enter into the White House in a, shall we say, mild recession. I do not mean like what Franklin Roosevelt inherited in 1933, and I don't even really mean like what Barack Obama inherited in 2009. But it is also fair to say that the economy was not what it was at the height of the 1990s. And like Republicans before him, to some extent like Republicans after him, what Bush said needed to happen was we needed to cut taxes. Americans needed to hold on to more of that hard-earned paycheck so that they could put that back in the American economy. Doing that would help dig us out of this depression or recession, really. The Bush tax cuts are going to be Democratic, small d Democratic on paper, meaning even I qualified for one, and I was selling shoes at a department store at the time. So if I'm qualifying for a tax cut, you know that pretty much everybody else is qualifying for a tax cut as well. Bush's problem is, on paper, they might come across as Democratic, but in reality, the top 400 wage earners clearly did the best under these tax cuts. Okay. The other problem is, keep in mind, again, if we're going to be fair, you got to give credit where credit's due. Bill Clinton handed over not only the presidency, but also a $5.6 trillion surplus. We're bringing in more money than we're spending, than we're sending out. We have disposable income. We talked about this. Clinton and the Republican Congress working to first balance the budget, and then ultimately we've got this surplus. That surplus is going to go away, and it's going to go away very, very quickly. Keep in mind, to cut taxes is to cut revenue, all right? It's not free. It's not like I'm just going to wake up on Tuesday and say, I think I'll cut taxes. There are consequences with this, and the consequences is very, very early on in the Bush presidency, we're already back in the red. We're running deficits. We're bringing in less money than we're spending, okay? And as we found out in the 1980s, that's not good. The other issue that George Bush felt very passionately about, that's going to be quite controversial at the same time, is what we call faith-based politics. All right? Organizations that are overtly religious, that do very good work, right? I'll allow you to make up your mind what that exactly means, but they do very good work. The controversy in the government supporting them is that we've always had this understanding that the First Amendment, freedom of religion, it means that there would be a separation of church and state. Now, yes, I realize and acknowledge that it doesn't say it exactly in that way, but the way that we have traditionally understood this is that the American government would not get behind one religion or another religion. We would not have a law that makes one religion or another religion the official state religion. What Bush begins doing in this faith-based politics is putting federal dollars, taxpayer dollars, into organizations that are very clearly, overtly, many of them Christian, evangelical Christian in their orientation, right? If you think of something like abstinence-only sexual education classes or instruction, that's a very good example as to what I'm talking about, right? I'm not saying that it's bad or abstaining from sexual relations is bad. What I'm saying is that the organization that is espousing this does happen to be overtly Christian, right? And that's where the controversy comes from. The point that I'm trying to make, guys, is that George Bush, early on in his presidency, is doing some things that are quite controversial. And a lot of people are quite taken aback that somebody that won this narrowly, somebody that many Americans did not feel won at all, was more or less appointed by a Supreme Court where his dad and his dad's former boss were very instrumental in appointing these justices. It's going to make George W. Bush a very controversial president very early on in his presidency. And then this happens, right? September 11th, 2001. Islamic extremist terrorists are going to hijack planes, and they're going to use them as weapons of mass destruction. We now know that it was Osama bin Laden's terrorist network of Al-Qaeda that will claim responsibility for September 11th. They will train in U.S. flight schools, and they will envision a scenario where these planes would be hijacked, and then the trained pilots, these terrorist pilots would take over the plane and fly them into buildings. Um, we saw this happen in some cases on live television. These planes hitting the trade towers, the World Trade Center in New York, another crashing into the Pentagon. Another is going to crash in Pennsylvania, but we believe that one was headed toward the White House. September 11th is going to change not only the Bush presidency, it's not overreach to say that it changed the trajectory of the world, the history of the world changed on that horrific morning. And in the context of this, George Bush is going to see his approval ratings soar. At no other point in time is he going to be more popular of a president than the immediate aftermath of September 11th. If you're looking at the PowerPoint at the bottom of the screen there, where he's got his arm wrapped around that New York firefighter, the bullhorn in his hand, he's devoting himself to protecting the American homeland. He proclaimed that freedom itself was attacked and freedom would be defended. Later on that night, he went on national TV and he declared that the United States was now at war. He said, we're now engulfed in the first war of the 21st century, a war that he described as the war on terror. Now, I remember listening to that talk. I was driving at the time, and I remember thinking to myself, well, he's being metaphorical. It's sort of like Nancy Reagan's war on drugs, right? Ultimately, he was not being metaphorical. He was being very literal. That we would start to come after those countries that we knew sponsored terrorism, those countries that harbored terrorists. In short, what we were demanding was you either turn over these individuals that were responsible for the attack or face war with the United States. The country that we quickly come to the realization is more than likely um, not complicit in this, is guilty in harboring these terrorists, is that of Afghanistan. It was well known that Osama bin Laden used it as a recruitment center, as a training ground for Al Qaeda. And we are going to put an ultimatum to the Afghan government group calling themselves the Taliban. Um, Hand them over or face war with the United States. The Taliban is going to say, we've got them and we want to negotiate. We're going to say, we don't negotiate in circumstances quite like these. Hand them over or face the consequences. They didn't hand them over, and they faced the consequences. The result is going to be the war on terror, guys. And you'll see what I'm talking about, how this is going to change everything in our next lecture. For right now, that's where I want to leave it.